This week on Deadful Sunday, we'll be taking a look at the report that air pollution has risen back to and exceeded pre-pandemic levels in some areas of the UK. According to The Guardian, air pollution in many towns and cities across the UK now exceeds pre-pandemic levels, exacerbating the risk of COVID-19 and putting the health of millions of people at risk. End quote. They refer to a study published on Thursday, which says that although air quality improved dramatically in the first half of the year as the country went into lockdown, pollution now meets or exceeds pre-COVID levels in 80% of the 49 cities and large towns that were analysed. End quote. Now, given that New Zealand has recently declared a climate emergency, one might wonder why air pollution is worse than before in some areas. To answer this, we will be drawing upon Willa Swenson-Lengyel's article, Moral Paralysis and Practical Denial, Environmental Ethics in Light of Human Failure. Whilst this article utilises Christian ethics and theology, I will draw upon its points at large without necessarily relying on its more religious foundations. Considering all this then, we ask in this episode, why do we keep failing the planet, and what can the individual do? Swenson-Lengyel outlines a number of different reasons for why people do not address the climate crisis. They note that there is an inaction from a crazier, moral weakness. I define the term as people knowing that which they ought to do, and yet not doing it. Much inaction arises from the simple fact that, as moral creatures, we are moral failures. I think a large majority of individuals experience a crazier in their daily lives in relation to environmental degradation and climate change. Simple things like they believe they ought to walk to the store, but instead they drive. They recognise obligation, but fail to fulfil it. End quote. A crazier, then, is the basis of this lack of response to the gravity of the problem, its global character, its amorphous and extended nature, or its wickedness. People do not know how to respond. One simply throws up one's hands and despairs. How could I possibly fix this? End quote. A crazier is then characterised by this existential despair that comes with such an overwhelming problem. Swenson-Lengyel, therefore, argues that people are ultimately unable to act with complete efficacy because the moral demand is so large and so extended that it is unfulfillable. End quote. We are then overcome by our own insignificance, particularly when articles such as this Guardian one we are attending to might make one feel as though all they are doing is coming to naught. And for others, this very same article may make them feel as though it's pointless to even try. The question then becomes, how are we to console the climate crisis weary? How do we address this feeling of insignificance? How do we invigorate people to act and continue to do so? Swenson-Lengyel notes three things of importance in this regard. Here I quote at length. First, people attempt to achieve righteousness on their own steam, through managing the moral demand as they understand it to make it attainable and discreet. Second, the terrorised conscience stands before the gravity and extent of the moral and spiritual demand, and experiences its full conviction. One is unable to attain the righteousness one had fooled oneself into thinking was within one's grasp. Lastly, this dialectic remains. Whilst this is not to say that there are not better and worse ways of living, it is to say that there is no complete overcoming this tendency. End quote. From this we can take two things. One, people seek this righteous or positive goal, and some act in accordance with the aim of trying to realise this goal. In aiming and striving for it, they feel as though the goal is in their grasp. Two, it is difficult, perhaps impossible, to overcome this tendency to terrorise one's conscience over the striving for and failing to realise an intended end. Considering this then, how are we to resolve this difficult bind that Swenson-Lengyel poses? The resolution to this, in my view, is to console the feeling of insignificance by leaning into it, by understanding that there is no way in which your actions alone can bring about total resolution. We might find some solace. You are insignificant. Your actions alone are insignificant. However, action in and of itself is not insignificant. This glimmer of significance comes in the form of collective action. By moving as a shoal, we might come closer to this realizable, if only partially realizable, end. We must understand that the I cannot change our reality alone nor overnight, but the we can. Furthermore, there too is little point downing tools and perpetuating the problem we feel so overwhelmed by in the first place. There is power in minute action. There is a point in the carrying out of what feels broadly useless. Lean into the insignificance and carry on doing what you can to limit the harm we do. This does not mean throwing caution to the wind and polluting it, but making and sustaining those small changes which feel also useless, but are also necessary. Much like the sacrifices made in dealing with COVID-19, why throw everything away when we've come so far and done so much? I argue we should keep plugging away in the margin with the goal of changing the whole. This marks the end of the 13th episode of DeadPhilSundays. We hope you enjoyed it, and that we'll see you again next week.